I am going to start the stream. Here we go.
Ooh, that's not good.
Yeah. Hello there. I see we are live. I think that we are live. I pushed go. Hello, chat. Nice to see you guys. I'm going to just wait a few seconds for this to get going while I make sure that everything is going well in the chat. Can everybody hear me? Hello. Hello, Internet. Hello, Internet. I'm really happy to be here live streaming with you guys. Unlike many of my live streams, I've done a lot of preparation for this one, and I think we shouldn't have any technical difficulties. We'll see how that goes. So we're going to be doing some PID tuning, which is what I'm known for. But I learned about PID tuning. I learned what PIDs do from Blackbox. And then I started learning how to tune PIDs by flying quads. And I kind of moved past Blackbox. And one of the reasons I moved past Blackbox was that I kind of felt like it's hard to look at Blackbox and just know what changes you should make to your PIDs. It's better, especially that PID controllers now fly so freaking good, even on defaults. Like getting that last 5%, it's really hard. And that's why I'm so happy to have finally discovered a tool like Plasmatree. And now for everybody out there who's saying, oh, Plasmatree's been around forever. I know, it's been around forever. I'm always late to the party. But having discovered it, I am super excited about it and learning more about it. And that's why my guest is here. My guest today is Steve Maslick. Most of you guys don't know who Steve is. Steve is one of my patrons, and he has been helping so much on my patron Slack channel, giving such good advice. He really seems to know a lot about Plasmatree. And so I said, hey, come on in here. And basically, you guys, listen, let me confess. The whole point of this is just for me to learn from Steve for an hour. But as long as I'm going to do it, hey, you all might as well do it too. And I've also, some of you guys heard I was doing this live stream, you said, oh, well, it's probably going to be Mark Spatz. But I've invited him to see if he can get away from his normal schedule and join us as well. Maybe a little later. He may be here, he may not. But for now, I want to introduce Steve Maslick. Steve, nice to meet you.
Hey,
welcome to the stream.
Thank you.
And
good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. And I'm just gonna show. Hang on, where's the? This is what Steve is going to be showing us today. This is the output of Plasmatree, and it's a tool for analyzing PIDs and analyzing what your quadcopter is doing. Now, I have a video already about how to download Plasmatree and how to set it up. That is linked down in the video description and in the RC Groups thread that's linked down there. So we're not going to be going into that. What I want to start talking to you about, Steve, is like, how do you fly the quad when you're trying to get data for Plasmatree? Because I think you do things a little bit differently than what it says over on the Plasmatree GitHub. What do you do when you fly the quad?
Yeah, I actually do. I think their recommendation is 20 to 30 seconds, line of sight typically, doing twitches on the different axes. And for the most part, I think the idea there is to get clean data that they can look at the step responses. I don't know. I didn't have much success with that, primarily because I'm not very good at line of sight. And I do think it's important to actually be moving forward, have some fast forward flight in there, which for me would end up having too many crashes in my logs.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I end up just doing my normal setup of the beta flight, and I think I'll use about 350 to 450 milliamp hours. I'm like you. I like flying by the the current. That's how I know when to land on my batteries. And yeah, it comes out to be about I don't know, on average 400 milliamp hours. But
Yeah, I'm looking at your
what I'll
log right now, and it looks like over on your log, I can see it's up at the top. It's about 120 seconds, so it looks like the log you've got up right now is about 2 minutes of flight.
yeah, yeah, and that sounds about right. For the most part, I will take off, and this is just kind of unique to where I am. Um, I will do a couple laps around the trees at various throttle ranges. So I try to maintain throttle um, eh, for at least one lap, and then I'll increase the throttle and increase the throttle again so that I have some good data at various throttle levels.
Yeah.
And then typically that's the extent of what I can do right there. But there's a field nearby, so then I just zip down the street, head over to the field, and I can do some uh, twitches, in the pitch direction and the roll
Okay.
direction as well. I'll
Uh,
try to put a couple a couple flips in either direction, as well as flips and front flips, back flips, whatever.
so
Get a
you
couple of those in.
you basically you're telling me that you fly relatively normally. You don't do the sort
Yeah,
of hover. What they suggest you do in the GitHub for Plasmatree is just sort of hover and do some stick banging basically. But you're doing more normal flying. And we can
yeah,
see that if we look at the top row here of your screen, we can see
right.
each of the three axes, and this is your stick deflection on each of the axes is the orange line. And down at the
Yeah,
bottom, we can see your throttle. And so we can see a few cases where you did like a full deflection move, but mostly it's just normal flying around.
yeah. It's weird. It's hard to get a lot of, or maybe this is just the way I fly, but there's not a whole lot of movement on pitch quite a bit. But
Yeah.
yeah, here, two back flips, two front flips.
Yep. Yep.
um, I try to do a couple of 360s, yaw in either direction as well. Yeah, split S's. I try. One of the things I do quite a bit is where I have a road which meets the park, so it's a straight line. I line up a large power loop on that, and that will tell me if I'm drifting to either side because
Mm-hmm.
keep I can keep my throttle pretty much without any yaw input and not worry about getting roll into my pitch as well. So I can tune I and P to a certain extent,
Yeah.
whether or not I have that drift. Yeah, and then just do a couple crazy moves, come back, land, and take a look at the log, see what it looks like.
So
Um,
so we're
yeah,
looking at a log right now, and what I want to do, I want to help people understand what they should be looking for because there's a lot of data here, and it might be a little overwhelming. What are the key things that you look for? Can we look at an example you've got of like a really well-tuned quad, and then we'll kind of go back to the beginning
sure.
and work our way forward. But let's look at a really good one and say, what do we see that's really good versus what we would see in like a really bad one?
Okay, so I have a chameleon with Hyperlight V4 motors, CO Racing F4, and I'm running D-Shot 600 on those. So for this testing, I used the default PIDs, Betaflight 3.4.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, all of these are with Betaflight 3.4. I don't think I'm at RC4, but
Mm-hmm.
it's probably RC2 or 3 or
Yeah,
whatever.
that's fine.
Um, so for this one, I have disabled TPA and the anti-gravity, set my D weight to 0, and VBAT PID compensation on. That's one of the things the wiki had mentioned to use. Sometimes I follow that, sometimes I don't. But
Yeah,
for this
and
example, I did.
and the key thing about these is they recommend in the Plasmatree wiki that you disable most of the features that like mess with your PIDs dynamically because it sort of dirties up the results.
Right,
Mm-hmm. So you've
right.
done that.
And the other thing about some of those as well is they require you to retune as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Absolute control, I noticed, and this is before I was 100% sure of what it even was, and I'm still not 100% sure. But um, I had everything tuned up. Then I decided to turn that on, and lo and behold, the tune wasn't very good.
Yeah.
So,
Can
and
I
I,
can I
yep,
interrupt you for 1 second? There are some people in chat who are saying that we're not live. We are live. Shut up. Go ahead. Go ahead, Steve.
okay.
Please continue.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, but we can cover that later. So for this case, RC smoothing on roll, pitch, yaw, throttle. I have the default throttle boost on. Absolute control, I-term rotation, and relax are all off. So it's basically like going into the PID tuning tab and saying restore defaults. And even a lot of the CLI options that are profile specific will get reset, like the I-term rotation and I-term relax.
Yeah.
So the first log is
So-
basically just default PIDs. And I think that's a good way to start.
Okay. Okay.
Well, you wanted to see an example
Yeah,
of
can
a
you
good
show a
one.
good what does a great looking one look like first of all? What do you
So I
look
think
for?
that's a good
What's the
looking one.
end goal that we're looking for? And let's start from
Well,
that.
honestly, the end goal really is kind of a feel thing too. I mean, you're no bounce back, no oscillations, no drift, and I think this is just a tool to get you there.
Sure. Sure.
So in the top graphs, you do see a little bit of bounce back where the blue's kind of peeking out from the orange.
So just to clarify here, what you're seeing there is the orange is your stick inputs and the blue is what the copter actually did. And what
Right.
you want to see is the least amount of blue possible, because that means that basically the blue line is tracking directly underneath the orange line. So whenever you
Yep.
see blue like right there at the top, that's a case where you had some overshoot or bounce back at the end of a flip or roll or something like that.
Correct.
And we want to minimize that.
Yes, and actually, the little bit that's shown here, I didn't notice.
Yeah.
On the pitch axis, uh, I don't even think you could pick that out in a high def, a 4K video. Overall, I would say that the gyro is tracking the the roll loop. Well, the loop inputs, I believe that's set point.
I think
that's
you're
owned by
right. It's not RC command, but it's you may be right that it's set point.
Right.
Regardless, it's
Yep.
just it's your
But
stick
there's
input though.
not a lot of slop in it, and
Yeah.
in that slop is where you'll see a lot of the blue doing weird things. Like, I know I have an example somewhere. Not exactly sure where it is, but especially at the end when you land, you may see a big blue line.
Yeah, that's just
Yeah.
the bounce where you landed. So
Yep.
you want to see not very much blue on the top row.
Right.
And then
Exactly.
on the bottom row, that's your step response. And what are you looking for there?
Okay, because on this one, I am using I-term rotation and I-term relax. You typically don't want to see much of an overshoot. A couple things that I look for. One is that it rises to 1 rather quickly and doesn't take its time and, 0.05 of a second or whatever. Where you'll see some logs where it gets to, halfway in that first block. 0.05 seconds. That to me, I think that's fine when you have D weight at 0. And then once you set your D weight to what you typically would fly with, you'll see it tighten up quite a bit. But generally speaking, you want it to rise up fairly quickly. You want to minimize the overshoot, which I have a fairly good overshoot there. But
yeah, that's a lot of overshoot. And what we're seeing here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is when that line is at 1, the quad is doing exactly what it's being told to do. And this
Correct.
graph is showing us how quickly the quad manages to do that. And when we see that line below 1, it means the quad is not responding aggressively enough. And when we see that line above 1, it means it's just responded too aggressively and it's gone too far. And that's why you say that that bounce there up to 1.25 is that overshoot, and then it comes back down and it tracks pretty closely to 1.0. That's what you're looking at there.
Yeah, the other thing, the light blue, light orange cloud, that's your error margin. Yeah, you typically don't want to see a large error margin. You don't want to see that cloud all over.
Okay, so this cloud you want if it's very large, it means your results may not be very meaningful, right?
Well, correct, because the line is just an average.
Right.
From my understanding from the wiki, this is just an average, and that cloud is your error margin. So if you have a large error margin, it means your actual results are all over the place.
Right. So you want to see, you said you want to see that these lines approach 1.0 and they get there pretty quickly, like in 0.025 or 0.03 maybe, but you gave 0.05 as kind of an outside, so like halfway here. And do you want to see overshoot, or do you want to see it kind of overshoot as little as possible?
Well, I think that depends. If you have your D weight set to 0, and all the other PID modifiers, anti-gravity, TPA, everything pretty much disabled, I think you do not want to have much overshoot, if at all. However, once, like with this log right here, this is with my normal setup. In other words, I have my anti-gravity set up. Whether or not it's doing anything, I don't know. But my D weight is set to 0.8. I have my TPA set up, and the value is, I think, where is it? I don't even know what it is now. I thought I had it in there, but usually around 12 or 13, somewhere between 1200 and 1400 for the cutoff, and anywhere from 0.1 to 0.14. It just depends on the quad. And then, yes, I think I also have I-term relax set for roll pitch yaw, the I-term rotation on.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
because of that, having this overshoot, I don't notice it. I don't see it in flight.
Yeah.
I don't see it in my video. I have nice sharp response. So for me, this is acceptable.
Yeah.
I think if I had disabled all that, you would probably not see that overshoot.
And what I see in your lines is that despite the fact that there is this overshoot, it is still comes right back down to 1 within, let's say, almost like 0.05. So it achieves the desired rate, overshoots a little, and then it gets there, and it kind of tracks. We see this line tracking. Now, on the pitch axis, we see a little bit more noise with the orange and the blue line. What's the difference between the orange and the blue line?
The orange is greater than 500 degrees per second, and blue is less than. I generally do not even pay attention to the orange. If you take a look at roll, I actually have a few more data points above that are greater than 500.
And we've got the degrees per second. I just noticed this actually, but here's the degrees per second right here. If you look at we got 2 mice on the screen. See it, mine and his. We can play fighting mice. You can't see mine, Steve. But here's the 500 degree per second line, and anytime it goes above or below that, that's when he went above or below 500 degrees per second. We can see there's relatively few times when you do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times on roll, 3 or 4 times on pitch, and that means that this orange line actually isn't based on very much data and probably doesn't mean that much.
Correct. That's why I typically do not look at that all that much.
Now the yaw axis looks really different. The yaw axis has almost no overshoot, and I've seen a couple other ones that are tuned like this. It seems it's got a little bit of a bounce, but the bounce is below 1.0, and then it kind of slowly rises to 1 at let's say 0.1 seconds, maybe even a little further. Is that an
Yep.
optimally tuned yaw axis?
Well, for me it is. If you look at the response time, this is about as perfect as you're going to get, up to 70%.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it, you know, with some of these other like on the pitch here, there's quite a bit of variation in the response times. Some of that, just not enough data can be tossed, and that's probably true in the higher throttle ranges. But it, it's graded on a color scale,
Mm-hmm.
and I think yellow is, you want to avoid the yellow. So this just is kind of fairly homogeneous.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know, when I raise it, to me, well, at least on this quad, the 70 for P, 55 for I gives
Mm-hmm.
me the yaw response that I want.
Okay.
Um, this top graph, actually, I see just a few areas of uncommanded movements, but they're fairly small, and I didn't notice it at the time.
Okay.
So as far as I'm concerned, this is good. Yeah,
Okay.
I could
Now let's
probably get that up.
let's go back to the beginning then, where you started the tune, and see what it looked like before you started tuning it at all, and see how that compares to what we're looking at now, which is.
Sure.
And I want, while you're loading that up, let me say one of the things that I'm thinking about Plasmatree is that people say, well, what does the best tune look like? And it's not necessarily true that there's one best tune for every person, because we're not tuning like a thermostat where we just want to stay at whatever 70 degrees 100% of the time. It's a very dynamic thing, and feel and pilot preference have something to do with it. The idea here is that as you get more experience with Plasmatree, you may be able to figure out that this is how you like your quads to fly. You like to see a strong overshoot to 1.25 and then a bounce back down to 1.0 within 0.075 seconds. Okay, you may get a sense for what you like your quad to look like and then tune towards that. So that's how I'm seeing this. Now this is the default PIDs, right? And what
Yep.
do you
This is
see?
default pits.
What do you and mostly because I've seen you on the Slack channel, you say, oh yeah, you need to raise your P by 5 or 4. You're giving really specific advice. So kind of walk me through your interpretation of this data.
Okay, I think some of that is just due to having seen enough of these and played around with it to get a good idea. Um, okay. Oh, by the way, I think we have another person that's joined. Mark.
Oh, is Mark Spatz joined in? Now Mark is muted. I set it so it would mute him when he first came in, so he didn't jump in. Let me see here.
That was a wise decision.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
Mark, you got
Hello.
Mark also
Hey
has
guys,
video.
how you
Mark,
doing?
welcome. Thank you for joining us. Everybody, Mark Spatz. You probably, if you're watching this live stream, you probably already know who Mark is because you're a tuning nerd. But Mark, your area of expertise is definitely filters and that stuff. Do you also use Plasmatree for PID tuning?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've jumped into it to the depth that Steve has, but the filter, I use it for a data point, essentially. So when I'm looking at logs, what happened is, honestly, Joshua, you mentioned it a long time ago, and I was like, oh, so I started doing some internet searching, and I was helping people out with logs. I would derive what I thought was a good suggestion, like, okay, what am I going to tell this person? And then I found Plasmatree, eventually got it downloaded, and then I was surprised a bunch of times where I was like, oh, good, that's kind of what this is saying too. And it, like I said, it made me feel a little bit more confident that I'm hopefully giving some half-decent advice.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, I use it as a data point. I don't use it as gospel. I just kind of use it as a second set of eyes almost to some extent.
And I would agree with that, except that I never did learn how to use Black Box Explorer for tuning. Using it for filters, yes, and other things, but PID tuning, no. And I've struggled with the whole, excuse me, tuning by feel, because some of the things I just never experienced. Some of them are subtle. I'm not quite sure what to look for. One of the things that I really liked about Plasmatree actually is it allowed me to get fairly close, so that by raising, say, P5 or lowering P by 5 or D, I now can see those differences. I can see those negative effects, and know that I'm fairly close. And actually, that's one of the on a different. I have a set of graphs for a different quad where I kind of show that by going up 5, going up 10, going down 5, going down 10, and from my initial tune. And just in flying for those examples, it's like, oh yeah, hey, this, when my P's too low, I get quite a bobble. I don't know. It's really hard to describe, but it just kind of, it's like it's just kind of flopping in the air a little bit, real slow oscillation. And then when you raise P too high, you get, well, you can have actually reduced prop wash handling, and also some higher frequency oscillations. But anyway,
Steve,
I agree with Mark. It's a good data point.
One of the questions that I see in the chat is people are asking, what is that center row of graphs showing? And I actually am not, I've never completely understood that either. So how do you interpret that?
It's, where is it? The plot window? I think this is where it's illustrated really well. So you have your throttle range on the bottom. Let me just go back to that. Yes, so 0 to 100% throttle. So clearly I didn't go much above, 65% throttle here. But this, the bottom row of graphs here, if you flip it up to the left, it matches up with this response time in seconds here. So this. So
how is it just redundant then? What is it showing us? Like, what are you looking for when you look at that? What conclusions do you take by looking at that data?
Okay. Well, I kind of like to see not a whole lot of yellow lines. If for me, all I'm really looking for, I guess, in a nutshell, is as I increase my throttle, is my response getting worse? Because I can tune my TPA with that.
And what would it look like when it was getting worse? Like, we see that there's yellow in some places and dark blue in other places. Which of those is what do you want to see as you raise the throttle? So raising the throttle is going to the right. Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of want it to look like. You want it to look like the yaw response here in this graph, where it is just a solid homogeneous color throughout the throttle range. If you see that kind of up to 20 or 30 or 40%, and then you start to see this little pixelated,
I see,
lots of yellow checkerboard in the higher throttle ranges, well, that's a good indication to me that I should be applying some TPA.
Yeah. So I think
how much, it all depends. But
I think what I'm picking up is that yellow is indicating more error at that throttle position, and blue is indicating no data at all. So what you want to see is like a sort of a light aqua color, smooth. If you start seeing a bunch of yellow, then that might be indicating that you're getting more error at higher throttle positions.
Color scale ranges from 0 to 2, dark blue to yellow. If lines look jagged or jaggy, then there's not enough for the averaging.
Yeah, so that's another point, is that when you just see, if you see a lot of, like in this log right here, you can see a good amount of input data, right? When it's the dark blue, that means there's no input data, or at least not enough that the software could use, so it skipped it or it didn't include it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look in there and you see a lot of it's like a defrag on your computer, since we're all semi dorks here. If you see a lot of the dark blue slivers in between all your data, or in between all your throttle ranges, that means you're really only picking up at those specific throttle values. You can see it says 0 to 100 right under the graph there.
Yep.
So if you pull that data in and that's what you're seeing, and then you see like an amazing, lower graph, it's like, well, that's based on not a ton of data though. It's almost kind of a checks and bounds. You want to make sure you have basically what this log shows, something to that extent or something pretty full. And then you can put more validity in the bottom graph, the step response graph.
Okay. Steve, let's go back to the beginning example and let's look at your response time graphs. And let's assess, this is the default PIDs, and let's assess what changes need to be made. Now, we said before we're mostly going to pay attention to the blue line, and we're kind of going to ignore the orange line because the orange line doesn't have a lot of data. There's just you're not going that fast very often. What do you see in the blue line, and what changes do we need to make as a result of that?
So one thing about this too is, and I just to make the point, this still flies very well, and I can bring out prop wash fairly easily, but I can also fly around it. So we're looking for pretty small adjustments here. This from the default, this would be perfectly acceptable to just leave it as is.
Yeah.
But because I want a little more responsiveness and I want to clean it up a little bit, so my response time, looking down at roll, it doesn't rise as fast as I would like it to.
Yeah. It looks like it first crosses the 1.0 line around, say, 0.3, whereas before it was further to the left and it was crossing much faster.
Yep.
So it was rising much faster. And there's not as much overshoot. It's a very sort of slow, instead of a sharp bounce and back to 1, by the time it overshoots and comes back, we're almost to 0.1 seconds.
Yeah, so you could look at it a couple ways. You could reduce your D to so that it's not, in quotes, damping P as much there, but that's not going to really help the response. So, I generally start with just increases of 5 for the most part, unless I know I'm getting close, and then we'll cut down to 2 or 3 or something. But,
so you're going to increase P in response to this, and is that actually what you did? Because I saw you had a sequence of changes you made.
Yeah.
So can we look at how that changed as you increased P?
Yep. And then real quick too, I have the same thing on pitch. Pitch actually tracks 1 fairly well, even though it's a little bit sloppy. On roll, I think I would raise I as well to get it to approach 1 a little bit more.
And I think what you're seeing here is that this blue line is pretty consistently riding low. So there is a persistent bias, and that's what I is intended to clean up.
Yep.
We wanted to try.
I don't know. Well, and you can see the effect in Plasmatree graphs for changes in I, but as I'm flying this, I also noticed that it was drifting too. So,
yeah.
Okay, so then. And
now, hold on, go back there 1 second. The other thing I noticed was, as we look at pitch, I noticed that we have a slow rise to 1, and then instead of kind of a bounce back down, it just kind of dribbles down here to 1, right? So that's, again, a very soft response. Yaw, actually, I think you ended with a yaw of 70. Yaw actually looks pretty much the same as when we started, so yaw was doing okay, I guess.
Yeah, for me, it felt fine. I didn't see the point of changing it, although I do believe I increased I on it. And real quick, I think my noise graph on this, because I tuned my filters first.
Yeah,
so,
let's skip the filters for now.
Go back to that? Okay.
Well, we'll skip the
Well,
filters because now that Mark's here, we'll definitely take the time to talk some more about the filters because I know that's
yeah.
something
Okay.
he spends a lot of time thinking about. Let's show the effect of raising the P on that response graph as you go through the images.
Yep. And actually, I just want to thanks, Mark, for all that you've done with your videos as well. They've been a big help. So
Yeah, definitely.
okay, so going
So here
back,
we've got PIDs of 46. That's P, I, and D as we're going through. So P is 46 and P is 50 on pitch. Now continue.
yep. So what I did for my next log is I increased P by 4, I by 5 on roll, and I think I only increased by 2, and then upped I across the board.
Okay.
So
What do we got?
That would be
Let's
log
do a little
3.
before and
Okay.
after. So this is
So-
now with a slightly higher P gain on both pitch and roll.
Yeah, let me see if I can manipulate this so we can kind of see them both.
Oh, that would be cool.
Okay, so
This is the
There we go.
the before and the after. After below, before on top.
right.
Mm-hmm.
And are you able to see that okay?
Yeah, no problem.
I noticed that I got a lot of gray space. And
No, it's okay.
not
You're
much I
fine.
can do about
You're fine.
that.
You're fine.
Okay.
Monsieur Mouche, the orange line is the times when the quad was going above 500 degrees per second. So basically like full stick deflection for most people. And the blue line is for times when the quad was going below 500 degrees per second. And what we concluded was that you almost never are exceeding 500 degrees per second, except when you're doing a flip or roll. So you basically ignore the orange line because there's just not enough data points to really be meaningful. So that's the orange and the blue line. Go ahead, Mark.
Yep.
I mean, Steve. Sorry, Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. The response has increased slightly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
However, now I'm getting a little bit more of an overshoot,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm also tracking one across
Yeah.
the graph.
We're tracking.
Much better.
Yeah.
I don't know a better way of saying it, but as far as the response time,
Now,
it's now going across.
pitch looks really. Can you make this full screen? But because pitch looks really messy here, doesn't it? Oh, I guess I'm being distracted by the orange line. I kind of wish we could get rid of it, maybe.
Yes,
But we don't have a clean bounce here. It's just kind of blah 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 blah. What do you take from that?
Are we looking at the right one? Yeah, log 3. Now, just on the aside, I think on all of mine, pitch is a bit messier than roll.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly why that is.
Mm-hmm.
My error cloud always tends to be, and I think it comes down to the noise graph, and that I always have more noise on pitch
Mm-hmm.
than I do on roll. But I've just kind of lived with it.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm looking a little better here, I think, as far as my roll is concerned. I'm pretty happy with that. I feel like my pitch is probably P gain on pitch is not where it needs to be. This is log 3. Yeah. So one of the things and just one general bit of advice too is when you're tuning P, you don't want to have your D's up in the 30s. In fact, I'd keep them in the lower 20s so that you can actually see the effect of.
Mm-hmm. Because D is gonna have it's not just a damping effect. I know people object to that, but it's gonna have an effect on the P response. So what we're looking for then is a relatively fast rise to 1 and a relatively sharp or quick return to 1. You continue to raise P then in response to this. At what point do you say, okay, P is about where it needs to be? What does that look like?
So I think I am pretty much where I want to be on roll with P.
Because I see it still seems to take quite a while to get back. If I were to pick where it gets back to 1, I'd say it's around 0.15 seconds, which is quite a while.
I also have D weight at 0. And
right, so you know when you raise...
when I put my D weight up to 0.8 and I increase my throttle boost, my response time and overshoot are going to look horrendous according to Plasmatree. But that's the feel that I'm used to. So I know that this seems quite of a long. The step response rising up to 1 seems like it's taken a little bit long here. But once I actually enable all the features that I typically fly with, that's going to tighten up considerably. Okay. In fact,
now how come you don't just tune with those features active?
I do.
Instead of anticipating what's going to happen.
Yeah, see, like here, you can see this is pretty much with my features, and you could even increase it more, but I end up getting a little bit more oscillations, jello in my footage. So I'm not a racer, so yeah, so I don't need it to go up there and over, up to 1.5 and then bounce down.
Okay, so you're raising P to create that sort of sharp bounce. What is? Did you mess with D at all in this? What is the sign that you need to? So
I did.
What's the sign that you need to adjust?
We missed some of that.
Yeah.
For this one, I also increased D by 3 on pitch and roll. And I know they say you don't want to change too many things at once, but I kind of knew that I needed to arrest the overshoot some too. And so
raising D will make this bounce smaller, right?
Yep.
But it may also slow how quickly the line gets to 1.
True.
And so it's sort of raising D sort of shaves off the top of this bounce and also slows down, makes this sort of trend to the right just a little bit. You get a slower response.
Yep. And one thing to remember too is that P and D typically should be a ratio. And you can tune your P and D to lower values and then raise them at the same in that same ratio.
Right.
So
by the way, guys,
like you have to get P up to the maximum, value you need, because a lot of times I will have my P's and D's fairly low, and then I start raising them together until I see negative flight characteristics.
Now let me just mention here, guys, if you hear any thunder in the background, we got a thunderstorm coming in here, and if my power goes out, the live stream may just end suddenly. I do have a battery backup, but if the live stream ends abruptly, that's probably what happened, and I'll see you guys later. But we're going to keep going. Can you show an example of, and I don't know if it's from this tuning session or another one, can you show an example of P too high? Or, when, because D too high is easy. Whenever your motors start getting hot, your D gain is too high. So, there you go. In my opinion, as long as your motors are cool and you're not, or maybe just warm, and you're not hearing kind of D term oscillation, then D can just be where it needs to be. But what's the sign of excess P in the log?
Okay, right here.
Yeah, Felstar, you can have low D and still get hot motors from various things, but if you are raising D and your motors are cool, it's probably fine. But if you're raising D and your motors are hot, then you have a problem. Stop. Now, what are we looking at here, Steve?
Okay, so with this log, I raised P by, I think 20 from what I normally fly with. Now, one other thing to note with this is that this is with my absolute control enabled. And so my P values are 6 to 10 less than what they would be if I was not flying with absolute control.
Now, what is absolute control?
So from my understanding, and this is more of a question for, I think, is it Gibber Jim or Joe Lucid,
Mm-hmm.
because that's his
Mm-hmm.
his feature. But from my understanding, there's a smart feed forward, and it. Oh yeah, I do hear the thunder.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
It whatever. I think it's between P and the smart feed forward, whichever value is larger, it goes with it, and then there's a cutoff. You know what? I don't know the math.
Okay. Okay.
But
So
see now, I want to note though too that Joe Lucid is primarily a line of sight flyer,
right.
and so
Exactly.
and I just figured, you know what? Let's try this feature, and it actually did a really nice job with yaw and
Okay.
also tightening things up, bounce backs. So
Yeah.
that's why I kind of use that and the I-term relax.
So are you saying this is an example of excess P gain? Because I mean, I see a big overshoot here. We're
Yeah, it
overshooting
is. I mean,
past 1.25. That's the biggest overshoot we've seen so far.
yep,
But it does get
that's
back
excess
down.
P gain.
It gets back down pretty quickly, and it tracks 1 really precisely.
Right. Now, if we were to raise it even further or reduce D,
Mm-hmm.
then you would also start to see a bit of a sine wave, and then with the after the bounce back.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I mean, I do have examples of this, but in this case, yeah, I don't. Yeah, you're right. I don't really see that, but
And here on pitch,
actually, now that I think about it, there
Yep.
on when you can see that to a certain degree on yaw.
Okay.
It doesn't actually get up to 1, and that's, I think, a lot to do with the authority of yaw.
Right.
But
yeah, the yaw
but
axis.
you do
is-
see you don't have D on yaw, at least with Betaflight. I know. I think Odin does have D on yaw, and also I think Butterflight. So there it's a little bit different. You do have the D to play with.
Mhm.
This is just specifically for Betaflight right here. But
Yeah.
I think back in that previous the Chameleon, you could see. Yeah, you can see a little bit of the sine wave.
Mhm.
You get the bounce back and a
Yeah.
little bit of sine wave. So you almost get into the point where you could potentially say, yeah, I might want to put a little D on yaw there. But
Mhm.
that when you have this after your bounce back on roll or
Yeah, we can
pitch,
see.
that's
we can
really
see
that's too high.
right here. We can see right here that this blue line comes up and bounces back, and that's fine. But then we can see it overshoots the other direction and oscillates just a little here, right?
Yep.
So that's a sign of excess P. What we want to see, I think, is either some people prefer to go for just a straight, no overshoot, straight to the line of 1.0. Some people prefer, and Steve, you're one of these, you prefer to have a little bit of overshoot and then back to 1.0 and stays there. But when we see it bounce back down on the other side and go negative, that's excess P gain. And we could solve that by adding D, or we could solve that by reducing P.
Yep. I mean, this is 20. I increased P by 20 here from what I normally fly with, and yeah, you don't have that oscillation, the sine wave effect of typical over. I think because of where my D value is.
Right, your D is raised a little, and I see here we've got a relatively quick rise to 1.0 around 0.025, and a big overshoot here above 1.25. But then when it returns to the line, it doesn't go negative. It doesn't overshoot any further the other direction, and it just tracks pretty well. And the same thing happens here on pitch. It's a slower bounce on pitch. Now, that probably has to do with the weight distribution of the quad. But it gets there just about as fast, maybe a little slower, and then it bounces back down. But again, it doesn't go negative and just kind of stays around 1.0. And that's probably a sign that P is about where it needs to be.
The orange line shows that oscillating above and below.
That's
1.
because those were very sharp moves.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So we've talked about tuning P and D a little bit, and what do you see in a log that tells you that you need to raise or lower I? Now, I is a little easier to tune by feel, but especially
Yes.
for a beginner, they may not know what they're looking for. What effect is I going to have on these?
So if you, well, you mean by feel or by Plasmatree?
No, by Plasmatree, because the whole
Okay,
point,
okay.
what I hope for
Yep.
from Plasmatree is for people who don't have a feel yet to be able to look at the logs and do something objective. So, what would you see in a log that would tell you it was time to raise or lower I?
Okay, that's 12 and 11 and 12.
And then I want to look at the noise graphs next. I know.
Okay, so this is with a very low I on all three axes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very subtle with Plasmatree here. You can clearly see on yaw that it's not quite up to 1, but
Yeah,
I wouldn't
it
necessarily use
never, no
yaw
matter.
as the example either, though.
But you can see that it never. Usually, what we've seen on yaw is that we have a small bounce that is below the line, and then it climbs to 1 and stays there. So it's slow to respond, but it does get there. But in this one, it never gets to 1. It is always slightly not quite reaching the commanded rate.
Right. What I typically see is a lot more jitter in the line with low I, and my noise cloud being a little bit worse.
Yeah, like we're seeing here, especially even the blue line is just
Yep.
all over the place. So you're saying that might be a sign to you that I needs to be raised.
Yeah, I mean, if you just go by where it is in relation to 1, you could say, well, I'm pretty much always on pitch. I'm always over 1, so that can't be. Maybe my eye is too
I mean,
high.
you are constantly pitching forward, but
Yeah,
yeah.
but I think in this case it's definitely too low, and it was this was very unflyable. It's hard to fly.
Okay.
Here is where I is way too high, and
here
now you start to see high frequency oscillations as well.
And we do see
Not to
that line
mention
is
the noise. The air is quite large.
I noticed the blue line is positive pretty much the whole time. Is that a sign of excess eye gain?
Yep.
Okay, so the way I'm thinking about it is that P and D shape this initial bounce, right? From being sort of a slow, soft rise or bounce to a sharp bounce with high P, and then D sort of trims that down a little bit and sort of molds it. And they sort of are in tension with each other, raising P, raising D. But then the overall magnitude of the line being either above or below 1.0, and the sort of squiggliness of the line, if that's a thing, that's the I term. Raising I gain too much will cause this line to be above 1. Having low I will cause it to be below 1. And if it's squiggly, then that's low I. We do see, but then as you said, if I is too high, we're going to start to see some sort of I term oscillations, which will also make it squiggly.
And actually, Felstar makes a good point with your high being too high. I being too high, D starts to fight it. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay, so it took us we've been going for almost an hour now, but I hope that we've got to some general guidelines that people can use. At the end of the day, you've got to get out there and play with it, and you've got to look at the differences. That's the only way to learn, but hopefully something like what you want to be looking for. Let's go over to the other screen that Plasmatree outputs, which is the noise graph. And if Mark, if you're still there, I hope you'll jump in as well, because I know, again, this is your sort of real area of specialty. What are we looking at here on the noise graph? Now, yours don't have debugs. I wonder if I can pull one of mine up.
I do have some.
Do you have any with debug?
Yep, I just got to find them. But if you have an example...
No, go for it. Your screen is already sharing. Go for it.
Okay, where did I put them?
Rotorman Dan, I'm not sure there are basic ratios between I and P. In terms of, I think a lot of people just fly the default I and don't modify it very much. So I'm not sure that there's an ideal ratio between I and P, but maybe there is.
Nope. You know, I don't have them labeled, so I'm just going to have to scroll through them very quick.
Okay.
Yep, there we go.
Okay, so this
There's
is
a noisy quad.
this screen is where you guys can figure out if your filters are working right. That's the gist of it. And the reason filters are so important is that the default filters are relatively conservative, because if your filters aren't doing their job, then you fly the quad and you smoke a motor. And the Betaflight devs do not want people flying Betaflight and smoking motors. So if your quad is relatively clean, doesn't have a lot of vibration, and is well built, a lot of times you can increase the filtering, or rather have less filtering, and that makes your quad fly better. And this is a screen that can really help you do that. So what are we seeing here, Steve?
Okay, so this is with the debug notch. So the debug column, if you will, that is just the pre-filtered noise.
Mm-hmm.
And then the D term, that's your D contribution to the noise. And then, of course, so I mean, if you were to compare this to a Black Box Explorer log,
yeah,
obviously debug is debug, gyro is gyro, and D term would be PID D.
So what we're seeing on these graphs, though, let's back up even more fundamentally. The x-axis of the graph is throttle percent. So that's representing your throttle position. And the y-axis of the graph is the frequency. And the color is the magnitude of noise at that throttle percent and frequency. So one of the things that you'll see here is this yellow line here, and what that's showing is that as you raise the throttle, the frequency of the motors goes up, right? We're seeing that's this little streak here. This is your motor frequency here. And we're also seeing some peak, a little bit of peak here, right around, let's say, 45 or 50% throttle, 40% throttle, and 200-ish hertz, right? So that's how we can interpret this. We can say at what throttle position and frequency is noise happening. And we don't see any data up here at the top because I guess you didn't go over about 80% throttle position.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And one of the hallmarks of this is that in a black box log, when you look at the spectrum analysis, and before I forget this, if anybody is going to Betaflight, people are going to Betaflight 3.4, when you go to set your debug for this, it's not debug notch anymore. It's gyro _ scaled is the new. Notch was an old name because it used to be before the notch filters, but there's now a low pass filter. The second low pass filter is the first thing now, so it didn't make sense anymore. So it got renamed. So if you are setting that, make sure to set your debug mode equal to gyro _ scaled. With this spectrograph, it's not cumulative. So when you look at a log in black box and you look at the spectrograph of your debug or your gyro for your pitch axis or roll axis, it's cumulative, which means the longer the flight, the more noise you'll see on the spectrograph, and it looks like it's noisier. This graph, the big, I guess, advantage is it divides out that throttle percentage and histogram, which is down just below the debugs. Mm-hmm. Or I'm sorry, just below the D terms.
Yeah, you're talking about this throttle percent, and this graph here is showing what percent of your flight you spent at each throttle position. Is that right?
Correct. So when you're looking at this, you should see a more even distribution of color, basically from a 1 minute log or a 4 or 5 minute log. Whereas in a spectrograph in black box, the 5 minute log is going to show so much more noise.
Yeah, it's cumulative is what you're getting.
It's cumulative, right?
And we can see here that Steve spent most of his time around 25 or 30% throttle. That's where this peak is, and relatively little time above at high throttle.
Right.
Yeah, and here's his individual throttle position throughout the log. Now, what I think is most interesting about this is all very well and good. By the way, some people in the chat are pointing out that it looks like there's more noise on gyro post-filtering than there is debug, which is pre-filtering, which is counterintuitive. But I think the scale, if we look up here, the scale is not the same for each of these, so the colors can't be compared directly. That's why it looks like there's more noise after filtering. What I think is most interesting about this, though, is that we can look over here on the right, and we can basically judge the effectiveness of our filters. Mark, do you want to talk us through this a little bit? What's over here on the right?
Yeah, so just to touch back on that, if you're on the latest version of Plasmatree, I think it's 0.52, then the scaling of all three graphs is locked.
Oh, that's good.
That's good. Done either, is it 0.5 or 5 point? I don't remember. But yeah,
it's 0.5.
0.5 or 0.51.
Yeah, a Ghost Rider, I think what we're taking from this is that you don't want to just use like a 20-second hover, although I want to acknowledge that's what Plasmatree suggests that you do. But what we're taking from this, and I've heard other people say, is they do a real flight, but you don't want to do like a 5 or 7 minute flight, if you could even manage that, because you don't want to just sort of average out all the data. So maybe a 1 to 1.5 minute flight of actual flying would give you some good data. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah. My 2 cents is you want to go out there, and if you fly hard, in a race or power loops and stuff, you want to, if you're doing this specifically to look at noise, you want to fly it hard so you can get your noise, because you don't want to set your filters and do things and then on a nice soft flight and then go really kick its butt, because you could burn a motor. So just fly hard when you're looking at the spectrum, and that's not necessarily the same thing then when you're trying to do your step response and do PID tuning. You're not necessarily trying to fly it as hard as you can. So essentially the graphs on the right hand side, the blue background shade is your gyro noise that's getting through to the D term.
So the blue is what's getting through the filter. The shade here is what's getting through.
Yes, and talking with Flo, that's what we talked about. Yeah.
That seems contradictory to what the actual the legend says. The legend says the blue shade is the noise and the blue line is the transmission. So I would think the line is what's getting through.
But look at it, says gyro noise. So that's your gyro noise is the blue shade, not the blue line. The dark blue line is the transmission. So that's the differential between the debug and then what gets to the D-turn.
So the blue is
the dark blue line is the effectiveness of the filtering, essentially.
And what we want to see is that dark blue line to be as low as possible, where the noise is as high as possible, except down. You may notice the line starts out up here very high. Well, down below about 20 hertz, that's the actual data we want. But somewhere between 20 and 50 hertz and below is the quad's actual movement. So we don't want to filter that, or we couldn't fly. But then the line drops down, and we see it filtering very effectively. Here, it's most effective, it seems like, around 200 hertz. And then we see it start to bump up around 400 hertz, because that's where the dynamic notch cuts out. Mark, anything to add there? Anything I got wrong?
No, so you can see the big dip in the blue line around 200 hertz on all three axes, and that's a instinctive of a notch filter. In this case, it's probably the dynamic notch. Yeah. And you'll usually see that dip, and that's kind of what my mantra is, that notch filters, love them or hate them, they cut noise hard. I mean, if you want to get rid of noise, notch is your job. Now, there's other, some people like them and some people don't, but I think the effectiveness of them is apparent in data.
I especially noticed that on the or the roll axis here, where we've got this noise peak right here at around 200 hertz, a little higher than 200 hertz, and that is exactly where the transmission is the lowest, which suggests that the dynamic filter is honing in on that peak and cutting it quite effectively.
Correct. Right. And here's another thing that I've noticed on logs is if you run a 32K log or 32 kilohertz log, you're going to notice that transmission line is much less. And you think, oh man, my filters are really just more effective in 32K. And what the differential is that at 32K or even in 8K mode, with a gyro on a MPU 6000 gyro, and if you put it on experimental mode,
Mm-hmm.
the data, the amount of noise coming out of the gyro is so much more than what we're accustomed to in normal 8K. You know, for the last 2-3 years, 8K was one number that everybody was really flying. 32K is fairly, what, I don't know, last couple of years, a year or so. I don't know. People probably argue. But when you see that, that basically means that your software filtering is doing most of the cutting. Whereas in this gyro, like, I don't even know this quad, but I can tell you this was an 8K. This wasn't a 32K.
Because when the hardware, you're talking about the hardware filter that's inside the IMU chip, right?
Correct.
So there's a built-in filter that we don't usually even see inside the IMU chip, and when you go into 32K mode, that filter is disabled, which lets a ton of noise through. And that's why back in the day, before Betaflight had the stage 2 filters, anybody who enabled 32K mode, their quad would just fly to the moon. But so the question is just who's doing the filtering? Is it the gyro chip, or is it the soft filters? And this transmission line only shows what the soft filters are doing.
Correct. So it looks like the soft filters are basically, the soft filters at that point are doing most of the load.
Right.
Versus an 8K, half of the load was being done by the gyro, and we never saw that data. That never showed up as the debug mode, you know, as a lot of noise. You'll see on an 8K or a 32K rig, your debug mode, you'll see, what I've seen is it's mostly yellow. The whole graph is just a whole much darker tinge of yellow, and then you have really dark yellow where the peaks are, but the whole thing is just a whole shade of yellow, much more than what you see here. So then obviously the filters are much, you know, since they're doing all that work, they're much more, that's why the transmission percentage is so much lower.
Right.
So
well, one of the questions, I don't want to get this comment before, hold that thought, Mark. One of the questions I saw in chat, and I don't want to miss it, is someone said, I have a Helio spring and I never see the debug and I never see the transmission line. And the reason for that is that in the Helio spring, the coprocessor is doing the gyro filtering, and you can't record the pre-filtered data because it's just not, it's not accessible. So on a Helio spring, you're never going to see this center column. You're never going to see the debug, and therefore you're not going to be able to see the transmission lines, and that's just a function of what the way they do their filtering. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, they just don't pass that data from the F3 board to the F4. Mm-hmm. It may be plausible or possible. You'd have to ask Helio if that's something that you would want to see in the future. But
let's not go there.
On this graph, you'll see that after the 200 hertz, that the filters look, it's almost like the transmission looks less effective. And it's like, well, how is that? If you know about low pass filters, they start at the cutoff of where the low pass filters is set. So normally your first low pass filter is set, I think Betaflight 3.4 defaults at 120 hertz. And as you go higher in hertz range, the filter becomes more and more powerful, there's more attenuation. But then when you look at the transmission line, you're like, why is it going up then? And talking with Flo, the developer from Plasmatree, it basically was, what he thought and what I kind of surmised as well, or was guessing at least, is that the noise on an 8K board gets so low, you can see how it just, on the blue shaded in the background there, it's so low that the percentages kind of drop off. You get into such finite amount of noise that there's really not much to crush or not much to attenuate. So then if there's not much there to attenuate, then the filter percentage can't be as high. So
what I hear you saying is don't worry about that. So normally a transmission line being high would mean noise was getting to your motors, and that would be bad. And so we see the transmission line here at the end of the graph at the higher frequencies, around 400 to 600 hertz. The transmission line starts to go up, and you might say, oh, well, is this a problem? And the answer is no. That's just because the noise is getting so low that sort of the numerator and the denominator and this goes up. So we can kind of ignore this right side, more or less, is what you're saying.
Yeah, anything above 400 hertz. And you can see it on the left side of the graph, the blue spectrographs there for the gyro, for the roll, pitch, and yaw. You can see around above 500 hertz, you just don't see any shades of yellow. So there's really nothing there for the the filtering to do.
Yeah.
And that's why the transmission percentage goes out of whack a little bit.
So, Mark, how would you use this screen to tune your filters? Because filtering less makes your quad fly better, but it also risks burning your motors. So where would you set the filters based on what you're seeing here? And how could we generalize that?
Well, the first thing I would do is I'd want more data in a full punch out. Like if you go to the percentage of throttle time there, it's between 30 and 40%.
Yeah.
I would want, some more 50s plus data, just run some power loops at full throttle or do whatever you got to do to get those peaks.
Because noise is going to be really bad at high throttle. That's when it's going to be the worst. So if you never go to high throttle, you can't really tune your filters.
Yeah, you could miss stuff, and then when you do go to high throttle, then your motors will get hot, and you're not going to. Depends how hot it is outside. If you don't know it, they might burn up.
Yep.
Although I will say, as your throttle goes up, so does the frequency of the noise. Generally.
That is true. At which point, it's more effectively filtered.
Yeah, and this is something I've been catching on to as well. If you go out there and just really rip it, and go fast and have a lot of time at high percentages or high throttle percentages, your noise is higher. So then the filters are more effective, and you can then move your filtering up. But then you have to watch. But then you have to watch, because if you're just doing a little line of sight, putzing around, you could smoke a motor.
Yeah.
So you should just put throttle on a switch, and we're good.
There you go. Only 100%.
Yep.
Well, it's been something, honestly, when people say, hey, I get hot motors, and now my question, is that you flying, or is that you just, looking line of sight, doing some punches and rolls and flips? Because mine get hot if I just am doing some punches and rolls and flips. But if I am out just normal flying and power loops and roll, doing some macro stuff, they're cool. They're fine. And it's, it's probably a combination of more errors moving past them. And then I was looking at the spectrographs, and the noise frequencies are lower. So my filtering, which I have set higher, isn't as effective. So it's something to consider. If you want an optimized rig for racing, well, then you're going to be up where you spend most of your time. But then it's kind of like a NASCAR. They can drive 200 miles an hour, no problem, or 150, but I don't think they can drive 20 miles an hour.
Not really.
They're not made for that.
So in general, we want to see less noise being transmitted, especially in, say, the 150 to 400 hertz range. That's really where our filters are going to be most significant. Is there a guideline we can have to? Is it just raise them until your motors get hot? Is there really any point to looking this other than just like looking at the pretty graphs?
Now, so what I would do on here is, you can see that definitely you need, there's some noise, and I'm looking at the debug mode, for roll, pitch, and yaw.
Yep.
And there's some noise right around 200. Looks like there's a secondary spike starting to form, especially in yaw, up around 350 to 400.
Yep.
So I would bet that more with some higher throttle, see what that pronounces. I know on my rig, I get a spike around 250 and then a spike around 450, which is the second resonance of that initial 250 spike. And it seems like the more time I spend at higher throttle, the more powerful that 450 hertz spike becomes. So what I do to address my noise is I keep the dynamic notch on, and I set a static notch right at 450 to attenuate that noise. And that allows me to push my low-pass filter. I've had my low-pass filter, my stage 1 low-pass filter, up as high as 170. My motors were still cool.
Yeah.
In flight.
One thing that I guess my filter tuning methodology kind of comes from Chris or CTC Snooze over in the Betaflight Slack. I look at the contribution of the noise in P versus D, and if the majority of the noise getting into the motors is D noise, then I usually filter more on D, and I cut back on the gyro filtering. That's why I typically run 2 low passes on D, and just 1 on gyro.
All right. Well, guys, what I want to thank you guys for talking us through this. I'm sure we could keep talking about it for 2 more hours, but I did promise that we would look at some submissions, and I would love to do that now. So if you just give me a second to get the screen set up, we will do that. Right. There we go. So this is the RC Groups thread where people made some submissions. And the first thing we've got is, let's see. Oh, that's my sample submission post. Okay. This is a guy who submitted tricopters. And I'm not sure, because tricopter has a yaw servo. And so I'm not sure how much useful information we're going to get there. But I do want to point out, look at his yaw axis. Look at the response graph for his yaw axis. How crazy is that? That's got to be the servo, right? We have this really slow response, but then we've got this huge overshoot.
Wait a second. Do you have that screen shared?
Do I? No, sorry, Mark. I am. Okay, let me see what I can do. Hold on.
Do I need to stop
No,
sharing?
I got it. I gotta do this, and then I gotta do this, and now I'm screen sharing. I think. Am I screen sharing? Yes, Mark,
Yep.
Can you see?
Yep.
Okay. Look at this yaw axis. Look at this amazing. We're at 0.2 seconds, and we finally peaked out. And here's our bounce, but it's this ridiculously slow bounce that never even really seems to quite get back to 1. And that's why tricopters have really, you need a massive, amazing servo to really do anything useful. So
what concerns me is up on the top,
right here.
all the over to the other side.
Here. Well, what's going on here? Yeah, we see these
uncontrolled motion.
These blue lines here.
Uncommanded motion.
Yeah. These blue lines here indicate that the tricopter is yawing left and right, but the orange line indicates that we hadn't commanded that. So who knows what's going on there? Yeah. Okay. So
we'll preface this though to say is I don't know much about tricopters.
So setting aside the yaw axis, as if you could just ignore one axis on a quad, Steve, what do you think you see here? And give us a suggestion, like a 30-second, 1-minute summary of what you see and what you would do to change this.
Okay.
Even though it's a tricopter.
I would toss out the orange line because there's not enough data points. So
right.
I would try to improve the response, so I would probably increase P. In doing that as well, you'd probably get it to settle down to the 1 as well.
Increase P on which axis? Both pitch and roll?
On both, but probably more so on pitch.
And why is that? Why more so on pitch?
Oh, well.
Is it because I notice on pitch that
it's sweet time there.
Yeah, the blue line, if we look at the time here, we're getting close to I would eyeball it at like 0.04 seconds, right? Yeah. So it's relatively slow. Its rise to 1, and then its bounce here, this is a big wide bounce, and it comes back down at like 0.012 maybe, where it's finally back to 1. So this slow bounce here says we need more P gain. Now we don't have a very big bounce here, but again it's relatively slow on roll and relatively slow to get back. So raise P is your diagnosis.
I would probably run a quick log, bringing D gains down to 25 on pitch and roll, just so I could see just how much contribution they are to the to arresting the P there. So I'd probably increase P, decrease D as well, just to have a better idea moving forward.
Okay, Mark, anything to add? Not to call you. I don't know if you were going to add anything.
No, I'm good. I'm multitasking. Sorry.
No problem. All right. So that's this submission, which we all agree. Let's just. I don't even know. I don't want to play the video. Let's look at the noise graph. See if there's anything interesting there. There's nothing on roll. What happened to roll? Roll doesn't exist. Okay. That's interesting. The filtering here is something. Look at this transmission. What is going on with our... What is going on here? There's like no noise. This really looks heavily filtered. I got to think that... You see how we have almost no noise here? This is clearly a low pass being applied to this. I got to think that...
70. You have a D at 80 and the gyro at 70. It looks.
Yeah,
like.
it's just being clamped.
There's also a notch at 400, 200 cut, 300.
This must be way back in the day. We would run the hardware low pass on the gyro at like 90 hertz, and one of the first things Boris did when he came up with Betaflight was turning that off and using soft filtering instead. And I gotta think that this has hardware filtering in the gyro, because this noise, we will always see a motor peak. We're just not seeing any motor peak anywhere. Look here. There's just nothing above like 150 hertz. It's all blue. So...
Well, and that might actually, some of that response time we were looking at earlier could be a result of the latency due to filtering.
Yeah. Hang on. I'm just trolling the chat real quick. I've got a running joke that Sharpoo died. I'm going to keep saying it, and people are going to think he actually died. And then he'll have to come back and fly again to prove he didn't die.
Do you think they'll release his latest movie and posthumously?
Oh, yeah. Somehow he keeps making movies even though he's dead. Alrighty. Let's see what else we got. Hey, Wark, you didn't make it. You didn't make it, buddy. Wark made a placeholder. Warka, whatever, Wark. He made a placeholder, but he never actually posted the logs. So sorry, buddy. Now here we've got a Taroa 7-inch. 7-inch. Now I'm really interested to look at the noise plots on the 7-inch, because they're going to have higher. It's going to be very different in terms of where its noise is. What do we see here? This again looks fairly filtered. What's the flight controller? There's like no... Maybe it's just that a 7-inch has lower frequency noise?
That's a 130.
Or the peak here is around...
It doesn't look like I can see what the D is. So
yeah. What's the... Kakute F4, presumably not in 32 kilohertz mode. Or is it? No.
No.
Well, let's look at his... I'm going to start by looking at his throttle. And I can see
he noise graphs look like that.
He spent almost no time above 60% throttle. So maybe that's why we're getting less noise. Most of the time is around 30% throttle. We're seeing very little... This is the pre-filter data. We're seeing very little noise above, say, 250 hertz. We get... so...
Yeah, it looks like an inherently low noise, because you don't see the dark yellows in there, which is great. I mean, that's what you want to be, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I guess this is also something that comes up for me when it gets into these 6-inch, 7 inches. It's like, what are you using this for? Because if you're just doing long-range cruising, you're not racing, then the amount of filtering there is probably fine. If you're trying to race it, you could maybe use less filtering, because just looking at the gyros, the gyro plots, it looks like they're almost too clean. For racing, you probably have a little too much latency there. But again, if you're doing long range and you want smooth footage, keep the filtering there. It doesn't hurt.
Yeah. And one thing to point out is that with the 7-inch props, you're going to have lower RPMs, so that shifts your motor noise down into lower frequencies. It's not going to be where you expect. On a 5-inch quad, the motor frequencies are around 350 to 400 hertz maybe. But on a 7-inch, they're going to be a little lower, and they may start getting down into what we normally don't think of as prop noise.
But I think the throttle has a lot to do with not seeing anything above 400.
That's true. He never really raised the throttle. Now, here's the response graph. And again, we don't have a lot of spikes above 500. So we're going to kind of ignore the orange line and try to look just at the blue line.
Fairly large bounce back, though, on those flips.
Yeah, we see a huge overshooter bounce here. The blue line extending beyond the orange line, so that suggests that there's some tuning that we might want to improve this. Oh yeah, every time right here, even here, I don't know. Might be just a little bit of bumping from taking off, but just every time we do a spike, we see this giant overshoot. So yeah, we could definitely improve this. I kind of use this top row as just a general goodness of the tune. If I see a lot of overshoot and a lot of sort of over here blue lines sticking out, I start to think, man, I should clean this up. But I can't help but notice that this line is super messy. It's just all over the place. What do you think of that, Steve? What's your thoughts about that?
Well, in the middle graph, there's not a lot of data either.
Right, because I see a lot of yellow here, and that's an indication that we don't have enough data. Is that right?
No, that's usually pretty crappy step response, I think, or
okay.
response time.
How do we know that we don't have enough data?
There's a lot of gaps. So like well, some people see it as dark blue. I think I see it as dark purple, but yeah, so there's a lot of those. And then also I think where it's quite patchy, like right where the C is on pitch, there's that like specific line there's just not enough data there.
There's a lot of gaps where it's dark.
Yep.
So you think that's the cause? We wouldn't try to tune out this blue bumpy line by like raising I.
I think we
would try to get more data
with it, but just know that the error is pretty large.
How could we get the error down? What would we do?
Well, the other thing too is that if you look on for pitch, right around 0.5, you have a sharp increase, and then it's not a plateau, but it kind of arrests a little bit, and then it shoots up to 1.25 there. And I wonder if that is I don't know if that is the result of D trying to hit it initially or not, or if that's an artifact. I could have sworn I read that was potentially an artifact, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
I think so. This is probably a 6S. It's quite possible that this, maybe these PIDs are a little bit high, so maybe I would start by lowering them, especially the Ds.
Now you say that, but if we look at the blue line, we don't see. I guess we kind of do see characteristic of high P gain because we don't have a massive overshoot in the blue line. It does go a little negative, but it's hard to tell if that's just because it's kind of all over the place. And it's worth pointing out that the size of this cloud is fairly big, so we have a lot of error. Yeah. Why do you say I'm going to reduce P here instead of doing something else?
Well, try to get something useful, I guess. I'd probably bring both P gains down, maybe 25, and reduce P's a little bit, just to try to get something a little more usable without so much error, I guess.
Yeah, I had the same problem when I flew the quad just normally. I had these massive error clouds that really, I wasn't sure how I should resolve that. I couldn't get useful data. I see a lot
of zero throttle too. So there are large areas of zero throttle. It looks like
looking right here.
Yeah. So maybe those are just split S moves, or maybe they're.
Let's see if there's anything else he's got. Let's look up something else.
Yeah, so now this looks a little bit better. Yeah.
The cloud is a little tighter.
Has a lot of characteristics, but now I can see
we got some gaps here a little bit.
But what's different?
Well, let's look at the PIDs. 53, 49, 27, 56, 51, 32. And we were at 53, 49, 27. So this roll hasn't changed. 56, 51, 32. Pitch hasn't changed. Yeah. Nothing has changed.
Well, I think what's changed is we have a longer flight, so there's more data. So I'm seeing a little less breakup now.
Okay. And we
And
can
maybe
see a little more of that characteristic shape of the overshoot and bounce back. The line is a little less scraggly, and the cloud is a little smaller. Do you still think, based on this, that lowering P is the direction you would go?
I would. I mean, that if you can eliminate the orange there, I see the characteristic oscillation plus the I would reduce P on both.
Okay.
And some of that error could be the result of P being too high as well. So
can I throw out a suggestion, because I know that Flo is in the chat. If I was better at planning, I would have asked him to join in the call, but I'm bad at planning. And anyway, can I throw out a suggestion that we have the option to turn off the greater than 500 line? Or, for example, if there's fewer than so many data points, or maybe as a command line option, or maybe it already exists, and I've just overlooked it. But a lot of times I think we're mentally ignoring the orange line and trying to see the blue line, but the orange line is kind of covering up the blue line. Might be nice to just turn that off. Can you do that, Steve? Is that possible?
I can't, no.
Yeah. Now, I noticed that on the yaw axis, this line looks very good. This is, if you look at a textbook of what a PID controller should do, they would say overshoot like this is bad. And what you really want to see is a kind of a fast and smooth curve. So yaw is canonically very good, but I can't help but notice that there is a ton of blue sticking out here. Why? What is your thought about that? If it's so good here, why is it kind of bad here? Any ideas?
Well, it's possible. Well, I guess the other thing is, was it a windy day?
Yeah, maybe we just have a lot of external.
Wind wouldn't typically affect the yaw axis like that, I would think, but
no.
But I do see a lot of extra blue in mine on days where I've had a large amount of wind, or even just hitting a branch.
The error cloud is quite small.
I think there's a piece to this, that the flight that you're looking at for your step response, like I mentioned before with the noise, you want to fly it hard for the noise, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But the flight for the step response, you don't want to be trying to induce prop wash. You don't want to be trying to.
This is true. Yeah.
You don't want to. Don't hit anything. Make sure you don't bounce on takeoff. It does clip off. I think the
last 2 seconds.
First and last 2 seconds, I believe, from flow of the log, but you only have 2 seconds, so make sure there's no.
I always tried to disarm while I was still in the air. I actually didn't know it cut off the last 2 seconds. I tried to disarm when I was still in the air, so that bump from landing didn't throw it off. But it turns out I didn't even need to do that. So there you go.
Yeah, you don't want to introduce a lot of prop wash. I mean, you're not going to fly extremely aggressive, but putting some flips in, some rolls, some 360 in the yaw, various throttle, flying with various throttle ranges, doing some punch outs. I think it gets me the best looking graphs.
Now, in this one from Seaweed UK, oh, go ahead, Mark.
Well, I know in talking with him, how he uses it is, not doing full flights. He's doing more forward flight motion, or hovers around, and you're trying to induce quick stick moves. Just like you would for a roll. Quick stick to the right, quick stick to the left. You can even use acro trainer if you want to now, because that's a mode, or what's the stabilization mode? Angle mode. Yeah, and just to get those quick, you're trying to do quick left, quick right, quick forward, quick back. Make sure it's not a windy day. So there's an environment that you want to reduce that amount. So it's like, how do you reduce that amount of fuzzy blue? Well, first you have to have your filters tuned well, that you're not letting gobs and gobs of noise through your gyro into your D term and P term. That's the first step. Second is the flight you're doing for your step response. Make sure it's not, on a windy day and all the things I just talked about, and don't induce prop wash and things of that nature.
I agree.
Now, in this one from Seaweed UK, I'll tell you what I noticed first of all is this orange line. I see some clear oscillation here, some just amazingly clear ringing oscillation. And I know we've been saying, well, you only have so many data points, but wow, that just really jumps out at me. I see that the error cloud is relatively small. The roll axis to me looks really amazingly good. Steve, do you agree or disagree?
Oh, I would agree. That's one of the best looking ones I've seen.
Yeah. So we got we quickly get to 1. It was a relatively small bounce, a tight bounce, staying below 1.25. Get back down to 1 very quickly, probably under 0.05 seconds, and then stay really close to 1. This looks like amazingly good to me. I'd be interested to fly it. We do still see...
This looks like a full flight almost, too. Yeah.
250 seconds, yeah. 250 seconds here. We do still see some overshoot. I wonder if this had iTerm relax on, which is a feature in Betaflight 3.4 that helps reduce overshoot on sharp moves.
I suspect you're not going to even notice that.
Yeah, you're probably right. Still, it's a little messy here. We got a little bit of miss. But it seems like the pitch axis or the roll axis is really tight here. Very, very, very good. Yeah. So what's the suggestion?
Yep.
No suggestion. That seems really great.
I think it's fine on both. And the reason I wouldn't, to be honest, I wouldn't even change this tune at all, is the next flight you go out, you bring back the log and you look at it. You could sit there and adjust things by 1 or 2 constantly after every flight. As if he's happy with the way this feels and the footage he's getting, and I mean, this is about as good as you're gonna get personally. And you could do another flight with the exact same tune and make it look a little better.
Yeah.
Or it could look a little worse, but.
Eventually, you just have to shut up and go fly. Stop tuning, go fly.
It's achieved its goal, in my opinion.
Yeah.
He got it to where he wants it, and
Okay.
I like that.
Let's see. And it says here he's got low pass at 180. I can't quite see where I read that, but his low pass is at 180, which is quite high. But if you're doing that without hot motors, you can get a good tune. And you can see an example of that here if you want to go to the thread and take a look at it.
Look at the noise graph once here.
Yeah, what's he got for the noise graph? What do we see here? Again, I think we're going to see this for a lot of quads that we're not going to spend a lot of time at full throttle just because that's where we're cruising.
Right.
We've got a big drop here.
For freestyle, that's probably about what you're going to see.
The notch, the effect of the notch is very clear. Here we've got this is probably the dynamic notch, but we can't be sure without looking at the filter. We can see the transmission going way down here, but the fact that the gyro noise drops off so quickly, this is probably the motor noise here at 375, I would guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be my guess as well.
And
that's extremely clean, though. I mean,
it's very clean. That's why he's able to get away with raising his low pass so much. Like you can see the difference between the debug and the gyro is just almost non-existent. We've got this is the motor noise here, but there's just almost nothing else but the motor noise. So this is a very, very clean quad. Or it's got hardware filtering. Okay, I think he said he was using an MPU 6000, so that's got more filtering.
He wasn't in experimental mode, was he?
I don't know. Let's have a look what he says here. Having a higher LPF has had a bigger effect on my quad's handling. MPU 6000.
I think he'd have a lot more noise if he was in experimental.
Yeah, I think you're right. More would be getting through there.
I've done a bunch of stuff. We were comparing some notes. Experimental essentially looks like 32K.
Yeah.
They both move. 32K moves your gyro's internal low pass filter up to around 3,000 hertz. Experimental mode on a MPU 6000 does the same thing.
Now this one here, Loader CZ says the problem he's trying to solve is these little vibrations, and unfortunately this is whenever you've got, like some people call them mid-throttle oscillations. Basically at like mid-throttle you just get these little random sort of twitches and jiggles and wiggles. Those are so hard to tune out, and it's not even really a PID tuning thing. Sometimes you can solve it with filtering, but it's just a really crapshoot trial and error trying to solve it. And the problem is that as we look at these graphs, we're probably still not going to see anything meaningful. Well, I could be wrong. I was going to say that the little wiggles and jiggles are so random that they just don't show up in the graphs. But, wow, what is this? Do you see what I'm seeing, Mark? What is going on
Yeah.
here at like...
Very noisy.
Oh, hang on. I'm sorry. Hold on. My scale was off. Look down. Frequency in hertz. So this has got an incredibly high sampling rate. That's all. 3,000 hertz. So he was sampling at like 6,000 hertz. Okay. So this is the normal motor frequencies. That's just the whole graph has been shifted down. Okay, never mind. Do we see anything? We've got frequency up to 1,000.
There's not enough. Look at the differential.
Where am I
between
looking?
The debug and the gyro.
Mm-hmm. Again, the scaling is not the same, so.
Right.
Yeah, but I've looked at scaling a lot, and it seems like a decent amount of noise is still getting through.
Well, we should see that in the transmission, right?
Correct. Does the dynamic notch on this?
He's
Well,
got his gyro
we could.
at 150.
He doesn't say. We could look at the black box log. This is a dump, a config dump. So let's see if that tells us if the dynamic filter is on. Let's see here. Where is that gonna be?
Feature? Yeah. I think it's a little farther down. Yep, he's got it on.
Yeah, it's on. Dynamic filter's on.
Wait, was that listed twice?
It said feature minus, and then in the dump, it always turns all the features off and then turns on the one it was using. So yeah, it was in there. It said feature minus and then feature plus. So he is using the dynamic filter. If you've got those mid-throttle oscillations, though, I mean, if we look at his response graph, I doubt we're gonna. Where is it? I doubt we're gonna see anything meaningful. Let's see. So this is fascinating, actually, because what I see here is, number one, we got lots of data here, all the way up through even 100% throttle. We've got just this one little blue line
Full
here,
flight.
but and a full flight, 260 seconds, and we don't have hardly any overshoot here. Like the P term just comes straight up and ends right where it should be. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I still think I think P's too low.
You'd like to see more bounce. I also noticed that TP. What is going on here with TPA? TPA is like all the way down.
I think that's a new default, or at least in the RC phase of 3.4. What is it at 1100? It's like 0.1, but the cutoff's at 1100. So it's I think the idea behind it is more of a gradual smoothing decrease of the PIDs through the throttle range.
I guess if it's only got a magnitude of 0.1, that's okay.
Yep.
Now I see some oscillation here on yaw, very clear oscillation. And if you got oscillation on yaw, man, whew. In fact, I'll say this. One of the things that can cause these random little twitches is excess yaw P gain. Yaw P gain doesn't really cause strong oscillation like pitch and roll do because the yaw axis is so weak, but it can cause these random things. And I got to tell you, the number one thing I would suggest is try reducing your yaw P gain and see if that fixes it. Take it down from 65 to maybe 50, or maybe even a little lower. That's lower than I would normally expect, but at least you'll have an idea if that fixes the problem.
I would agree.
Yeah. Oh, great. 2 for 2.
Yep.
All right. What else we got? He solved the vibrations by changing to different props, but they're still there. Yep, still got these oscillations here. So, what the heck is going on with his P, though? Look how fast. It comes up pretty fast, but it has no overshoot. And it's not like he has extraordinary D-gain. His PIDs are pretty normal. So weird. So weird.
Well, that depends, too, on if maybe he's got a real high throttle gain. Not throttle gain, throttle boost gain. Or possibly just, I guess what kind of a frame he's running as well.
Yeah.
It's real light.
Maybe. Let's see here. We're getting close to done. Reefs and fridges. How much more? No, that's it. This is the last one. Reefs and fridges. Let's see. Quad's flying pretty good on defaults. Bit of prop wash overall tune. Let's look at the tune here. 70 seconds. We got a lot of stick banging here.
It almost looks like a line of sight.
And we can see here that the throttle spent almost no time down below like 25% and almost no time up above. So it looks like this was like a hover with some stick banging. Now our error cloud is very low, but the fact that we're missing so much data concerns me. What do you think, Steve?
I would agree. I'd like to see more of the throttle range in there.
Yeah. But this is actually closer to what Plasmatree and Flow, the developer, suggests you do, to be honest.
True.
Yeah, and I would take it from here. So this isn't, looking so bad. Maybe they could increase D a little bit on pitch, right? I think it's at 21 or 23, or I can't hardly see it. Just to eliminate some of that bounce back.
Now, D on pitch. On pitch, we've got a relatively slow rise, so we don't get to 1 until getting pretty like 0.04, and there's not a very big bounce. So, Mark, it's interesting that you're suggesting that we raise D, because it seems like that would make this bounce smaller, but it's already pretty small, and it would make our rise time slower, which is the opposite of what we want.
Yeah, so your rise time you can get sped up. See, there's details in this, like do you have D set point weight set?
Yeah, if
things
that's
of that
at
nature.
0 and then you move it to 1, you'll cut this in half.
Okay.
Right. So then if you still have a little bit of bounce back with this kind of move, with this kind of setup where you're doing the stick banging, if you still have that little bit of overshoot there, try increasing D a little bit and see where that goes.
Now, Flo in the chat, who is the Plasmatree developer, has noticed that the eye gain on this quad is 60 and 65, which is pretty freaking high, and is pointing out that we can get overshoot because of that. But so maybe the first thing we would do here is lower the eye gain. However, I thought we said earlier that high eye gain will cause a persistent bias in the positive direction, but we don't really see that here. We do have a very smooth line, though. So that's consistent with high eye gain. Yeah, okay. So reduce eye gain, get a little more sort of throttle position in here, not just hover. No? He says no, it won't. Hang on. No, it won't what? Let's see. Oh, he says it would result in negative eye error. I see. No, it won't cause the line to be high. Okay.
What? Say that again?
Flo says that excess eye gain would result in eye negative error, which I guess, does that mean we would be below the line if eye is too high? We'll see what he says. If it's over 1, it would result in negative eye error. We don't see hardly any overshoot here either, but these eye gains are pretty high. These lines are pretty flat. I think I would want to raise P on roll, because D is already not that high. I want to see it bounce a little. But canonically, this is actually a pretty good curve with not too much overshoot and staying close to the 1 line. So arguably, this quad is flying pretty well, just may not be flying how we like it. I don't know. I do also notice that this yaw P, I think yaw P is a little high as well, because what I see here is that yaw P rises to 1 much faster than we've normally seen it do, and it's got some oscillation here. So my gut feeling is yaw P is too high.
Bring that down.
Okay. All right, that is the last submission, and I think we're going to wrap up. I appreciate you guys, Mark. And hang on a second. Oh, hey, there I am. Hey, look, we're not looking at graphs anymore. Mark and Steve, thank you guys so much for coming. I feel like I've learned a lot. The bottom line, the takeaway for anybody who's still here, who's stuck around, I think the takeaway is that you got to fly your quad, and you got to look at the changes that the PIDs make, the P, the I, and the D make, and generate the graphs. and look at the changes that they made. Unfortunately, this is pretty time consuming because it takes a while to generate the graphs, and just flying raise P, fly raise P, fly raise P, generate graphs, go look at them and look at the results. It's just a lot of management of data. But if you love PID tuning, or just go fly the defaults, they're pretty good. Steve, any final thoughts?
Well, I think from defaults, it usually just takes me 3 or 4 flights to kind of lock in my PIDs. Because it really is based on feel, and I use the Plasmatree to kind of help make sure I'm actually guessing in the right direction. Because if I just go off of feel, then I'm constantly raising, lowering, and sometimes I don't quite get where I need to be. So this is just a nice little tool to make sure that my initial thought is correct, or if not, point me in the right direction. But you can usually get to where you want to go in just a few flights, I think.
The thought that I had as you were saying that, Steve, is you could almost just, if you have black box on your quad, save the black box logs from all your flights and then generate Plasmatree and just look at them. And if you've got a quad where it was flying pretty good, and then you're not having to constantly be doing this tweaking and trial and error process, but at least you can start sort of soaking up the data. Go ahead, Mark. I think Mark was about to say something, and then I cut him off. No. Oh. As soon as we give up, he'll come in. He'll jump in. Mark, any final thoughts? Okay. There you go. All right, guys, we're going to wrap up. We're just coming up at the end of 2 hours. Thanks again to Steve and Mark for coming and helping out here. And thanks to Flo for making Plasmatree. I really mean it when I say that after learning about PID controllers through black box, I almost completely gave up tuning with black box, because the changes we were trying to make, it was just impossible to look at the PIDs and go, this, you need more or less. You could just do it just as well by feel, which is not to say you could do it very well, but you could kind of get it there. And I'm really happy that Plasmatree is there, because it gives us an insight into what the PIDs are doing that you just can't get with black box. So it's really awesome. Maybe someday we'll actually see, wouldn't it be nice if Plasmatree was in Black Box Explorer, so we could just open up and it would just be there? I mean, this is great data. So hopefully we'll see some more of this as I get better. I'll make videos about what I'm thinking about it. And thanks also finally to the devs of all the firmwares we fly: Betaflight, Flight 1, Butterflight, KISS, Drone, etc., etc. I've left someone out and they're going to be mad at me. Thanks to all the devs for making quads that fly so freaking good on the defaults that half the time you don't even have to tune them. So that is going to do it for this live stream.
Thanks for having me.
Steve, absolutely. Great. Steve, thank you for the help that you give on the Slack and probably elsewhere with all the tuning advice and stuff. It's great. Yeah. It's always great to see people giving back.
Keep doing it.
Yeah, for sure.